Many of you reading this may be too young to remember the exploding whale incident that occurred in Oregon in the late fall of 1970. Heck, I'm fairly certain that quite a few of you weren't even born yet. So, I'll give you the basic overview. On November 9, 1970, a 45-foot-long sperm whale washed ashore on the beach near Florence. For 3 days, it sat there, drawing spectators and local government officials alike. After the first day or so, people were warned to stay away from it. The official reasoning given was that there was concern that curious onlookers might climb on top of the carcass and fall in addition to the putrid stench that overtook the entire beach and the threat of the body bursting. In less than 2 days, the Oregon State Highway Division was called in to dispose of it. They consulted with the Navy and many munitions experts and came to the conclusion that the best way to treat it would be like a boulder and use dynamite to blow it up. And on November 12th, with local and state news watching, they did just that, using half a ton of TNT and creating one hell of an explosion which sent chunks of whale and sand over 100 feet in the air, even crushing in the roof of a nearby parked car. That's the official story, of course. It's all a load of hogwash, though. I know, because I made the mistake of getting too close to it one night, myself and Harvey. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, though. Let me back up. I was just a youngster back then, no more than 11 years old. I lived with my folks in Florence, which back then was much smaller and, in my opinion, a much nicer place to live than it is today. I was sitting in the kitchen waiting for my mother to finish making me waffles and eggs before being taken to school when my father entered, having just stepped away to receive a phone call. "What do they want, Gordon?" my mother asked, turning to face us, causing her black and white checkered apron to swirl slightly on her waist with a spatula in her hand. My father grunted as he sat back down at the table. Darndest thing, actually. Apparently, a sperm whale managed to beach itself out on the sand. They want me and a few others to go out and take a look at it before it starts to cause a nuisance. Dad worked for the local government, specifically in the area of maintaining the beaches and parks for both locals and tourists alike. "Can you take me over to see it?" I asked excitedly. It had been years since a whale had washed ashore here, and I wanted to finally see what my father had spoken about dealing with once or twice before, but he simply shook his head. "Afraid not, kiddo," he said, tousling my hair with his hand. "This is grown-up business and a little too dangerous to have you around." He began to chow down on the eggs and bacon my mother brought to him. Maybe next time, he finished, speaking around bites of his food. I hung my head, feeling slightly dejected as I began to eat my waffles and eggs. When I got to school, many of the kids were talking excitedly about the whale. I heard that it's huge, black, and stinks to high heaven. Kirsty, the girl who sat next to me in math class, said to her friend in front of her. "Gross," her friend retorted, scrunching up her nose and causing both girls to break into a fit of giggling, which was fast silenced by the teacher clearing his throat. Later, as I sat in the lunchroom, eating pizza squares and carrot sticks, my best friend Harvey came over and sat down, along with the 2 others in our friend group. "So, has your dad said anything about the whale?" Michael asked, using the sleeve of his shirt to wipe pizza sauce from his face. I shrugged my shoulders. "All he said was it washed ashore, and it was too dangerous for me to go see it," I admitted. Harvey let out a loud belch after downing his chocolate milk, earning a huge laugh from our group, and a stern look of disapproval from the lunchroom monitor in the back. "I heard that it's already attracted a huge flock of seagulls and crows around it," he said after settling back. Gregory chimed in, "Yeah, and that it's covered in slime." We all looked at him and laughed. "You really need to stop reading those dime store pulp novels from your parents' bookshelf, man," Harvey said, then leaned it close, all of us doing the same. "I heard that it has super sharp and bright white teeth. That's what my older cousin Janice said when she stopped by this morning. Her and her boyfriend had gone for a walk on the beach when they saw it." Gregory looked at him. "Wait, what was your cousin doing with her boyfriend out there so early?" he asked. Harvey made a face. "Probably doing some of that gross romantic stuff," he said with a tone of disgust, each of us scrunching up our faces in a similar manner. "That's not the point, though," he continued. "The point is, none of us has seen a beach whale before." He looked around at each of us, a small, sly smile beginning to etch across his face. "So, what I'm thinking is, why don't we go down there after our parents go to bed and look at it? Maybe even take some pictures with it. He pointed at me. Alan, didn't your dad just buy you that camera a few weeks ago? I nodded my head. I mean, yeah, but I began, but he cut me off. Then why don't we make an adventure out of it and go and see it? He pressed, looking around hopefully at all of us. Michael spoke up. I can't do it tonight, Harv. My parents are going out to dinner and leaving me with a sitter. You know I can't sneak past Michelle if my life depended on it. Harvey let out an annoyed snort. Fine, maybe not tonight, but what about tomorrow night? He asked. He looked at Gregory. What do you say, man? He asked him. Gregory sat a little lower in his seat, trying to make himself smaller. I don't know, man, he said quietly. If mom or dad catch me sneaking out that far, I'll get grounded for life this time. Harvey let out a disgusted sound. You are such a little chicken shit, he spat. We all gasped at the swear. Each of us had heard our respective fathers let out the occasional curse word around us, but after I'd made the mistake of shouting damn it, when I stubbed my toe trying to fly up the back porch steps and was rewarded with a bar of soap in my mouth for it, none of us really ever said them again. Harvey, being the member of our group who liked to break the rules the most, clearly did not care. He raised his hands and shook them in a mocking way at us. Ooh, he said, before lowering them and looking at me. What about you, Alan? He asked. Will you come with me tomorrow night? He leaned in and grinned. Or are you too much of a scaredy cat to come with me? I felt my cheeks grow hot and glared at my friend. I am not a scaredy cat, and you know it, I growled defensively at him. Who was the one who went into that abandoned house last year? I continued. Who was the one who climbed into that sewer pipe after everyone else chickened out? It was me. I sat up straight, trying to sound as unaffected and tough as I could. Then come with me, Harvey said, looking at our other two friends, and show these two chickens how to become men instead of staying little boys. His comment earned mutters and annoyed glances his way, but he was focused on me. He knew he had me. He knew I hated being called scared or a baby, and I would always take the bait when he used the line. So darn gullible in retrospect. Finally, I looked him dead in the eye. Fine, I'll go with you, I said. Yes, he said, grinning like he had just walked into Woolworth and been told by his parents that he could choose whatever he wanted for lunch, with a root beer float. So here's what we'll do, he said, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. Meet me in back of your house in the alley at 11 tomorrow night. We'll bike across the bridge into the dunes where the whale is. Bring your camera and we'll get proof we were there. I was about to answer him when the bell rang, signaling that lunch was over. He shot me a thumbs up as he stood up, dumped his leftovers in the trash and returned his tray. Michael and Gregory patted me on the shoulders as they passed by me. Good luck, man, they both said, leaving me to stare after them and wonder what on earth I'd just agreed to. I spent the entire rest of the afternoon until the end of school staring out the window, unable to concentrate on schoolwork. All I could focus on was what I was going to do with Harvey tomorrow night. When Mom picked me up at 3, I barely said anything to her about how my day went. Instead, I just looked out the window of her station wagon at the Cieslaw River and the hulking shape of the dunes on the other side. When my father got home that evening for dinner, I ran over to him as he sat in his recliner watching television. So what happened? I pestered him as he attempted to watch the news. He looked at me and gave a tired smile. It's big, alright, he said, yawning slightly, and it smells like 4-week-old garbage in the dump. They're unsure of how to get rid of it, and with that, he patted me on the head and went back to watching the screen. At dinner that evening, he spoke a little more about it to my mother when she asked about it. You know, it's strange, darling, he said as he devoured the casserole she had made. Normally, this would be a local matter, but for some reason they called in the Highway Division, along with some bigwigs from the State Coast Guard and naval bases. It's stranger because I swear I saw 1 or 2 men studying it like it was some kind of specimen in a beaker, he added, before being shushed by my mother and told to finish telling him once little ears, code word for me, had gone to bed. As I lay in bed that evening, attempting to fall asleep, and instead gazing around my room at the Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen movie posters on my wall, I thought about what he'd said. Why would such important people want to look at a dead whale? I thought, what could possibly be so special about it? I shrugged it off, then turned to face the wall as I felt the first tendrils of sleep begin to seep into me. The next day went by in a blur. The words of my teachers and friends echoed in my head and went straight in one ear and out the other, bouncing around in my brain like a beach ball, but never sticking. When Mom brought me home, I told her I was going to play in the backyard for a little while. Go upstairs and change your clothes. Then she called as I took my books upstairs. I'll whip your sorry behind if you get grass stains all over your nice new school clothes. I did as she said, changing into a pair of jeans and a t-shirt before discreetly grabbing my father's latest present to me, a brand new Kodak Instamatic camera and a handful of flash cubes, and heading out the back door. In our backyard sat an old, rusting Ford Model T which had belonged to my grandfather. My father always spoke about restoring it in his memory, but never seemed to find the time to. Making sure my bike was leaning against the side of it where it couldn't be seen by my parents, I slipped into the cab and hid the camera and flash cubes underneath the seat before stepping back out and throwing a baseball at our fence for a few hours. After dinner time, I watched a movie being shown on the TV with my father in the living room. I believe it was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and then kissed both of them goodnight and went to bed, pretending to fall asleep. I listened and at around 10 heard them climb the stairs and shut the door to their bedroom. I waited another 20 minutes to make sure they were asleep, then threw back the covers, revealing I still had on jeans, sneakers, and a shirt. Grabbed my coat off the hook behind my door and crept downstairs, careful not to accidentally cause the floorboards on the stairs to creak. I slipped out the back door, turning up my collar at the chilly fall night air, and breathed in deeply. I whispered at the smell of the ocean wafting over the dunes and into town, then crept across the backyard to the darkened shape of the truck. Reaching through the open window, I retrieved the camera and flash cubes, along with a flashlight I'd swiped from under the kitchen sink, grabbed my bicycle, and wheeled it out into the alley where Harvey was waiting. "Well, did you bring the camera?" he whispered, and I held it up where it could be seen in the yellow street light over our heads. He nodded, then pressed a finger to his lips and signaled for me to follow him, hopping onto his bike and pedaling away. I hopped on my own, and after flicking on the handlebar-mounted light to guide my way, pedaled after him. The town seemed extremely eerie at night with all the stores closed and the houses dark. It felt like biking through a ghost town, or a nightmare, I thought, before shaking my head. The last thing I wanted to do was scare myself into turning around. Harvey would never let me live it down. We passed through intersection after intersection, always keeping an eye out for other people. At one point, we ducked behind a fence as a police car came slowly lumbering down the road, waiting for it to pass before continuing on. Soon enough, we passed over the bridge leading out of town and towards the dunes, the air growing colder and the smell of salt water growing thicker as we approached our destination. Finally, we came to a point where we couldn't bike any further due to the sand catching our tires, and chose instead to hide our bikes among the far side of the first dunes. Turning on both of our flashlights, we let the yellow beams guide our way as we walked to the beach. "So, what do you think it's gonna look like?" he asked, his voice filled with obvious excitement and glee. I shrugged my shoulders before realizing he couldn't see it in the dark. "I don't know. It's been a day or two. Dad always told me the birds start eating it by now, so I think it'll have a lot of holes in it." He let out a low whistle. "Cool," he said. "I wonder if I could stick my hand inside it." I groaned. "Don't do that, Harvey. You'll never get the smell off you, and then your folks will know we've been out here." He scoffed. "Like I give a damn," he muttered, and I shook my head simply. After another 5 minutes, we both stopped. "Ugh, what is that smell?" Harvey exclaimed, covering his nose and mouth with his hand. "My guess, we're close," I said through my own hand. "Man, that stinks," he said, then continued leading the way. I started following him when I accidentally walked into his back. Nearly crashing to the sand, I raised my light to shine on the back of his head. "What's the deal?" I hissed as my face throbbed with pain, but he shushed me, turning around and lowering my light. "There's someone there," he hissed back. "Kill your light." We both clicked ours off and listened. He was right. I could hear hushed voices coming from up the beach in the direction we were heading. "Quiet," I heard Harvey whisper, and then saw him crouch forwards. For a moment, I thought about just turning around and leaving. I don't want to get in trouble. Not where Mom and Dad are going to take me to Disneyland for Christmas vacation in a few weeks. But I couldn't just leave Harvey there by himself, so I reluctantly followed him. When I reached him, I stared out at what he was looking at over the dune. I could see the dark shape of the ocean from here. It sat less than a few hundred yards from where we lay on our stomachs. We also finally saw the whale. It lay on its side, about 10 feet from the water's edge, its shape hulking and gigantic. White-lined ridges spread out the top of its back, while the rest of its shape was nothing but smooth blackness. It was easy to tell these features because currently there was a light on it, a bright one. Behind it, I could see 2 or 3 figures standing and talking amongst themselves. Then they began to walk towards us, us. Down, I whispered, and Harvey and I made ourselves as small as possible behind the dune. The sound of footsteps digging in and kicking up the sand approached, and I heard a snippet of their conversation as they passed by me. It's incredible. I heard a man say, 2 days out of the water and still maintaining vital signs. Combine this with the alterations, and I think we've discovered a whole new species. One far more predatory and dangerous than we've ever seen before. We've got to get on the horn and get this information out. They drew further away, and their conversation dimmed and grew unintelligible again. The two of us stood up. What were they talking about? I asked, gazing towards the darkness where they'd gone. Who cares? Harvey said, shaking the sand off his coat and pants. It means we have a chance to get the pictures, come on. And with that, he began running down the last dune to the giant, dark form on the sand. I followed, slower though. Something about the way the men had spoken had made me feel a twinge of uneasiness. Still, I plodded behind my friend towards the shape. As I drew closer, it rose higher and higher above my head, until it seemed to tower over me like one of the buildings I saw when my parents took me to Portland. Harvey drew close to the side of the creature. The smell was overpowering now, and I forced myself to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. He reached out towards it. Harvey, don't. I whispered urgently. Nothing's going to happen, Alan, he said, putting a mocking tone as he said my name. It's dead, after all, remember. And before I could say any more, he placed his hand on it. Immediately, he drew it back, his face a look of disgust. Gross, he exclaimed. What? I asked, afraid of what he'd say. It's slimy and cold, he said, then chuckled. I don't believe it. Gregory was right. He chuckled again, then waved for me to follow him around the other side. Before I stepped after him, I noticed something odd. The birds have barely touched it. I followed after him slowly, and as I drew closer, I heard him gasp. Holy shit. Alan, come look at this. Walking quickly, I rounded the edge and saw what he'd seen. The whale's mouth was huge. It yawned before us like the opening of a cave, its teeth looking like the stalactites and stalagmites at the entrance. It was wide enough that we easily could have walked inside. Wow, I breathed, staring into the blackness beyond. No joke, Harvey said excitedly. It looks exactly like the whale from Moby Dick. He ran away from me down to the other end, and the tail is huge. It's as wide as a car, he called. I heard him run back towards me, and he reappeared in the light behind us. You've got to take a picture of me in front of the mouth, Alan, he exclaimed. That would be the ultimate picture to have. All the kids in school would think I'm the coolest kid there. I glanced around, looking to make sure the men weren't coming back, then pulled my camera and a flash bulb out of my coat pocket. Alright, but just a few pictures, and then we get out of here. Before they come back, I hooked a thumb back towards where they had gone. Yeah, whatever, that's fine. Just take the picture, he insisted, moving to stand towards the edge of the mouth. I looked down and pushed the flash cube into the slot at the top of the camera, then moved away about 10 feet to make sure I got as much of the whale in the shot as well as him. As I raised the viewfinder to my eye, a strange feeling came over me. It was almost the same feeling I had when I would turn to find my parents watching me out the window of the house. It was a feeling of being watched. Though when I looked away from the camera, I saw nothing. Nobody. What are you waiting for? Harvey hissed. Take the damn picture. Shaking my head, I again raised the camera, centered the viewfinder on him, then pressed down on the shutter button. The area for a split second lit up even brighter by the flash from the cube, and the burning smell that would come with it followed a second after. Take another, he insisted, bending his arms up the way bodybuilders did and striking a pose. I did as he asked, but as I pressed the shutter button, something above him caught my head. High over both of our heads, I could just barely see the edge of one of the whale's eyes. It was just a tiny glimpse, but something about it seemed off. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness again, Harvey picked up a piece of driftwood from the sand, then held it out like it was a spear he was about to throw. One more, he said, chuckling as he attempted to look like Captain Ahab. I sighed, still feeling like I was being watched, but obediently raised the camera to my eye and centered on my friend. That's when I noticed it, a flicker of motion from where I have seen the edge of the eye. I hesitated, staring at the scene through the viewfinder, noting that there was more white there than there had been before. Did its eye just move? I lowered the camera. Harvey, I said tentatively, you may want to get over here. He looked at me, annoyed. I will, he said, raising the driftwood again, after you take the damn picture. I was about to speak again when I heard shouting coming from off to the side, frantic and out of breath. I turned and saw the three men who had passed by us sprinting towards us, arms waving over their heads like they were trying to signal an overhead airplane. For a second, I couldn't make out what they were saying, then it became clear. Get away from it. For the love of God, get away from it. Came a man's cry. Harvey, we've gotta go. I shouted, no longer trying to be discreet. I turned and saw him drop the piece of driftwood, a panicked look covering his face. What happened next happened in a fraction of a second. One moment, he was there, beginning to run towards me. The next, something flashed out from inside the whale's mouth as quick as a lightning bolt. I didn't get a good look at it, but from the little I did, it looked like a tongue, but not one I'd ever seen before. This looked like it split apart into 3 pieces, and it looked as though the surface of it was covered in small, sharp hooks. In that same instant, they wrapped around Harvey with the fluidity of a boa constrictor, and then he was gone, yanked back into the mouth and down its throat. He never even had time to cry out. That's when the men reached me. One grabbed me around the waist and threw me as far as they could, back towards the lights they had set up. I fell hard on my side, the air driven from my lungs. When I stared up, I felt the color drain from my face. The whale was moving, thrashing around on the sand in a frenzied attempt to reach its next meal, and it had found it. The man who had thrown me had been snagged in the clutches of its tongue, and with the same speed it had taken my friend, yanked him back into its gullet. He, however, had managed to let out the beginnings of a scream. It was choked off as he disappeared inside. I scrambled to my feet, unable to keep myself from crying, snot running down from my nose. Run, kid. One of the remaining 2 men shouted at me, waving at me with his arms. I took a last look at the thrashing creature on the sand, and saw its eye, its diamond-patterned eye, filled with a mix of colors from black to red. The eye focused and locked onto me, and I felt my pants dampen as I pissed myself in fear. Screaming, I turned and took the man's advice, running for my life back towards where my bike lay hidden. I barely remember getting home that night. The frantic pedaling back into town and home, along with dropping my bike into my backyard and getting back into the house are all a blur. All I know is, the next thing I remember was my mother shaking me awake. Alan, honey, I need you to focus and tell me something, she said seriously. Have you seen Harvey since school yesterday? I didn't know what to say to her. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, so instead I simply shook my head. She looked at me for a second, then nodded and went back downstairs, telling me it was time to get ready to go to school. As I got out of bed, I realized I dropped my camera when I ran. The entire rest of the day, my mind couldn't focus on anything but the memories of the previous night. My parents and my teachers all noticed it, but they choked it up to worrying about my missing friend. When Michael and Gregory approached me in the cafeteria, I said nothing when they asked what happened, if we'd gone out there. I just felt numb. I kept replaying over and over in my head that image of my friend being snatched and swallowed whole. It was a sight I would see for years in my dreams, waking me up wearing a sheen of cold sweat on my skin. When I got home that day, my father was looking at me strangely and also disapprovingly. Alan, when I went out to work today, I was approached by one of the men working with the highway division, he said sternly. He said he found this lying in the sand out there. He held something out to me, and I felt my heart begin to race as he held out my camera, which had my name written on the back. He continued, "What have I told you about taking care of your valuables, young man? This camera isn't cheap, and you can't just leave it wherever when we go to the beach like we did last weekend." I looked up at him in surprise. He handed the camera to me. "Just be lucky that it was returned to you, and don't ever pull this again. Do you understand me?" I could do nothing but nod my head, lowering it so he couldn't see my pale face. He turned and walked away from me, and I waited until he was in the kitchen before reaching and opening the back of the camera. Inside, it was empty. The film cartridge had been taken from it, obviously by someone who didn't want anything coming back to me. I never heard from those men again. They must have deemed me as not a threat, someone who wouldn't speak about what I saw that night. So they left me alone with my returned, empty camera as enough of a message. A day or so later, I sat on the living room carpet with my father behind me in his recliner. We both watched the news reporter interviewing members of the highway division as well as members of the public who had been kept a quarter-mile away from the black shape rising from the sand and waves. I couldn't help but shudder at the sight of it, my eyes filling with tears for my lost friend. A few moments later, everyone pulled back and the explosives were detonated, sending huge chunks of it into the air. The reporter ended the segment, interviewing spectators again and telling viewers that the remaining chunks would be buried in the sand. I got up and walked out of the living room. They hadn't blown it up for the reasons they'd said. They never blew up any whale that beached itself ashore again, not even when over 40 beached themselves at once. 9 years later, they blew it up because it was the only way to destroy that monster. They never found a trace of Harvey. His parents spent over a year trying to locate him. His face ended up on posters and even the back of the milk cartons. I knew they'd never find him. Any trace of him was obliterated when that explosion went off. I'm 64 now. A few years ago, they aired a 50-year anniversary segment about the whale, or whatever that whale-looking creature was, and it made me remember all the repressed memories I've tried to lock away in the deepest recesses of my mind. I tried to forget again, but I cannot. So I've decided, for the betterment of my mental health, as well as possibly a way to soothe the scars on my soul, to post this here. I know nobody will believe it, but that's okay. The truth is out there now. Harvey's true fate is out there, though his parents are now long dead. Two things keep picking away at my brain, though. Even in my advanced age, I shudder to imagine if it was that dangerous beached on land, what would it be like to meet under the waves? And two, and this is perhaps what has kept me out of the ocean for all these decades, how many more of those things are out there? Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.